Hello, welcome to the last lecture on the digestive system. This is lecture 11 once again. This is part 3. Today we're going to talk about the large intestine, about defecation, and about the defecation reflex, and that will finish off our digestive system lectures. This material is from chapter 23 in Marib. Let's first talk about the anatomy of the large intestine. As you see here, the large intestine basically frames the small intestine on three sides. It extends from the ileocecal valve, which is right here, all the way to the anus, which is down here. Its diameter is greater than that of the small intestine, which is why we call it the large intestine. Its major digestive function, if you call it that, is the reabsorption of water. It really doesn't carry out digestion like the small intestine does. It also absorbs some metabolites that are produced by resident bacteria, and we'll talk about that a little later. Now let me first talk a little bit about the blood supply of the large intestine. We mentioned this before. The first 2/3 of the large intestine, as you see here, are basically supplied by the superior mesenteric artery. You'll also recall that the superior mesenteric artery supplied all of the small intestine as well. The last 1/3 or so of the large intestine is supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery. Those are the main blood supplies of the large intestine. The veins that drain these are comparable to the arteries. So we have the superior mesenteric vein draining the first 2/3 of the large intestine, and the inferior mesenteric vein draining the last third. And as all the veins do coming from the abdominal organs, you'll notice that these eventually empty into the hepatic portal vein, and this goes to the liver. Now in terms of the parts of the large intestine, the very first part of this is known as the cecum, and you'll see that this is more or less a little pouch that hangs down. Extending from the cecum, we have what's called the vermiform appendix. Most of us know this just as the appendix. Kind of like a little pinky hanging down from the cecum, and this is believed to have some function in the lymphatic and immune system. The second portion of the large intestine is the ascending colon, so material from the small intestine will be going up this way, which is why we call it the ascending colon. This continues to just around the liver, where it turns, and this is known as the right colic, or sometimes the hepatic flexure. And this will turn and become the transverse colon, which you see here, that goes across the body. This will continue to the other side right around the spleen, where it turns once again, and this is known as the left colic, or sometimes the splenic flexure. This will continue down, so material is moving down this portion of the large intestine, so we call this the descending colon. This will eventually go into the S-shaped portion of the colon here, which we term the sigmoid colon. And finally we go into the rectum, the anal canal, and finally the anus. The longitudinal muscle that surrounds the rest of the alimentary canal is reduced to just 3 small bands of muscle in the large intestine. These are known as tenia coli, as you see on the right on the bottom of this slide. This will pick up again and become a complete muscle as we near the anal canal. Between the circular muscle and the tension provided by the tenia coli, what happens in the large intestine is that we create pouches that are known as haustra. So you see these small pouches, one of them I'm tracing out here and one next to it. So these are known as haustra. The material is basically stopped in each haustra and turned so that more water can be reabsorbed from the material within those. These small bits of fat that you see here are bulges of visceral peritoneum. They're called epiploic appendages. Nobody really knows what their purpose is, but we'll see them when we look at the intestines of the cat. Okay, so that's the basic anatomy of the large intestine. Once again, it's the cecum, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, anal canal, and anus. Now, as far as the histology of the large intestine, it doesn't have the sophisticated structure that the small intestine has in terms of modifications to increase the surface area. For example, there are no plicae circulares, there's no villi, there's no microvilli. You'll see that the mucosa of the large intestine is very simple, however it's pretty thick. And this consists of simple columnar cells. Sandwiched in between the simple columnar cells are abundant goblet cells. These of course produce mucus that helps the material move more easily along the large intestine. As the material goes from the small intestine into the beginning of the large intestine and then progresses around the different segments of the large intestine, water is withdrawn, as we said before. Water is basically reabsorbed. And what happens is as the material progresses, it becomes harder and harder and harder. So as it moves along, some of this mucus is squeezed out, and this basically helps the material slide along the mucosa of the large intestine. Now, the large intestine does not produce any enzymes. Any enzymes that are present within the large intestine are basically leftovers from what are produced in the small intestine. So really, there's no digestion that takes place in the large intestine except just residual digestion from the presence of enzymes and material in there. The main function of the large intestine is right here, and that is the absorption of water. We have about 1,500 milliliters of water that enters the large intestine every day. Of that, only about 150 milliliters of water leaves the body in the feces. So that's quite a significant reabsorption of water. It also reabsorbs some bile salts. When we talked about the liver and the gallbladder, remember we mentioned something called the enterohepatic circulation. Bile from the liver and gallbladder come down, enter the large intestine, and 80%, perhaps 90% of those bile salts get reabsorbed in the large intestine and then get recirculated again and reused. And finally, the large intestine absorbs a significant amount of electrolytes. As we said, there are abundant goblet cells which secrete mucus. This helps in lubricating, also protecting the wall of the large intestine, regulating the pH somewhat in the large intestine, and also binding the material together that passes through it. In here we have the conversion of bilirubin to urobilinogen and stercobilinogen. These products are present and some of them will be reabsorbed. The large intestine houses a great number of intestinal flora. In fact, in your book, I think it mentions there are about 10 million different kinds of bacteria that we have, or different flora that we have in the large intestine. It depends on what book you read. We have about 800 species or so of bacteria. The microflora of the large intestine are important because they liberate vitamins from the material that passes through, like vitamin K, vitamin B5, biotin, and these vitamins are then reabsorbed by the large intestine. And of course, the bacteria also process carbohydrates and produce about 500 milliliters of gas, or what we call flatus, every day. And of course, the large intestine forms and stores feces for defecation, and then defecation is carried out, as we'll see in a couple of minutes, by the parasympathetic defecation reflex. As you see here, the longitudinal muscle resumes the structure that it had in the rest of the alimentary canal and pretty much surrounds the entire rectum and anal canal. Now, the smooth muscle that forms the circular muscle in here, as well as the longitudinal muscle, which stops right around here, forms something that's known as the internal anal sphincter. So since this is smooth muscle, of course, this is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. This is not voluntarily controlled muscle. However, on the outside, you'll notice also we have an external anal sphincter in the vicinity of the anal canal and anus. This is skeletal muscle, so this is in fact voluntarily controlled. So we have two sets of sphincters that surround the terminal opening of the alimentary canal. This is the internal anal sphincter, which is involuntary, and the external anal sphincter, which is a voluntary sphincter. Now, the main function of the rectum is temporary storage of fecal material. What will happen is material is normally not present in the rectum, but when it does move into the rectum, as we'll see in a couple of minutes, the walls of the rectum are stretched, and this initiates what we call the parasympathetic defecation reflex. You'll notice that within the rectum we have what are called rectal valves or rectal shelves. These will separate solid material from gas. And the rectum passes into the anal canal, which is here. In the anal canal we have structures called anal columns, and these basically surround structures that are called anal sinuses, which are recesses between the anal columns. And these exude mucus when the feces compresses these. So this aids a bit in movement of material through the anal canal. By this time, as you can appreciate, the material is the hardest that it's going to be because most of the water has already been reabsorbed. You'll notice a transition in the epithelium from the anal canal to the anus. This, what I'm drawing in red, is known as a pectinate line. And here the epithelium transitions from a simple columnar to this is a stratified squamous type lining. Also has some different innervation in this. The anus is lined by keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So obviously this is to protect this particular portion of the anal canal. And one last thing we'll mention here is that the root word procto, as you see down here, means anus or rectum. For example, a proctologist deals with diseases of the anus and rectum. Now, some of the movements of the large intestine are a little bit different than those of the small intestine. These are actually slower and less frequent than the movements that we saw in the small intestine, which occur pretty regularly. Some of these movements are mixing movements. We refer to these as haustral churning. These occur about every 30 minutes or so. As we mentioned before, the haustra are those pouches in the large intestine, and haustral churning helps to turn the material in the large intestine so that more water can be reabsorbed, and they slow the transit time of the material through the large intestine. The other type movements that we have in the large intestine are known as mass movements. Typically these follow meals and are stimulated by the distension of the stomach and duodenum. There's a neural connection between the stomach and the duodenum and the large intestine, so that when these areas of the stomach and duodenum are stretched, we have a gastrocolic reflex and we also have a duodenocolic reflex. Recall from our naming of the reflexes that we have gastro, stomach, colon, second, and then we have duodenum, colic, or colon. What this means once again is that these reflexes are going in the same direction as the material is traveling through the alimentary canal. Therefore, both of these reflexes are stimulatory type reflexes. And what these will do is they'll aid movement in the large intestine, and these are called mass movements. When a mass movement occurs, we have a peristaltic wave that passes through the transverse colon, through the rest of the large intestine, and will typically begin moving material into the rectum and begin stretching the rectum, and then that will initiate the parasympathetic defecation reflex. You'll notice these numbers on the right correspond to the numbers in the figure on the left. So here's some material that has basically moved into the rectum from the sigmoid colon, and when that happens, the walls of the rectum are stretched, and this sends afferent sensory information into the spinal cord. Parasympathetic motor fibers cause contraction of the rectal wall, and they also cause a relaxation of the internal anal sphincter. Now what happens is when the rectal wall contracts and pushes inward on the material in here, this material is going to be moved this way, so it makes sense that the internal anal sphincter would relax to allow the material to pass out of the body. The other thing that happens is as the material moves along, there's a reflexive contraction of the external anal sphincter, which is here. Remember, we have two sphincters, and so there's a reflexive contraction of the external anal sphincter, and this will be maintained until it's convenient to defecate. This is one of the things that babies have to be trained to do, right? This is potty training. So their external anal sphincters are not trained when they're born, and so consequently, pretty much after they eat, they defecate. And finally, let's talk a little bit about what feces actually is. There's about 75% water in fecal material. Remember, though, there's about 150 milliliters of water total released from the body every day. There's about 25% solids. And of those solids, we're talking about things like electrolytes, mucus, many bacteria that pass out of the colon along with the fecal material. And we also have sloughed epithelial cells from the wall of the large intestine. There are some bile pigments in here that give feces its characteristic color. Some of the odors we can detect in fecal material come from bacterial action that produces compounds such as indoles, scatols, phenols, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, which are really very odorous type compounds. And finally, in the fecal material, we have indigestible materials. Remember when we talked about the different classes of carbohydrates, we said that complex carbohydrates, or polysaccharides, that were derived from plant material, such as cellulose. We're incapable of digesting cellulose, so that material basically passes through our body unchanged and will form what we call bulk or fiber. One of the most important things that fiber does is it traps water. So it retains water in the feces so that it doesn't become as firm or hard as it otherwise might, and this enables it to be more easily passed out of the body. So fiber in the diet is very important for that reason. This also helps to cleanse the colon and absorbs some other materials that should be passed out of the body. So that finishes off our lectures on the digestive system. Next time we'll begin talking about nutrition and metabolism with Lecture 12. I will see you then.